Federal agent, come out peacefully or I will use force.
Fuck you! I'm back here, waiting for you!
Oh, this is gonna be good.
The Xbox 360 was a big deal. In the months leading up to launch in late 2005, I read everything I could about it on every major gaming website and in every magazine. Remember those? The jump from the 5th generation to the 6th generation of consoles was practically night and day in terms of graphical fidelity, so the next leap was expected to be big. After plenty of tech demos and pre-rendered teaser trailers kinda sorta being passed off as gameplay, it was time to finally see some real games from these new systems. I will never forget getting this issue of Game Informer, a cover story about a real next-generation game, Condemned, courtesy of Monolith Studios, developer of the 2 greatest FPS games ever, Blood and Fear. I said what I said. The image is striking. A lady wrapped in chains, a terrified look in her eyes, bathed in a green hue. I love looking at this cover, and if you look closely, you'll see that it still says Xbox 2. This was before the 360 moniker was revealed to the public. That's how far back this goes. Oh, and look at the top left corner. Wanda and the Colossus, the original name for Shadow of the Colossus, and a review for Devil May Cry 3. I miss Game Informer.
Excellent.
Anyway, the screenshots for Condemned looked incredible. I specifically remember the environmental lighting and how big and detailed the weapon models were. But aside from the shiny newness of it all, the premise and gameplay concept was what got my undies to stick. The video game equivalent of Seven and Saw with first-person bum fights sounded alright to me. So, late 2005 was upon us, and my brother was able to wrangle an Xbox 360 for himself, luckily. Oddly enough, I specifically remember that he could only find the model without a hard drive, and had to order the drive from out of state to use his console. Remember when Microsoft basically scammed everyone into buying the so-called HD model? Yeah, I remember. Anyway, he got one, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. At the time, we lived with separate parents, and hearing him hype 360 games was really exciting. Finally, he came over and showed me his collection. He had some great demos, like Fight Night Round 3, which blew my mind. And I thought Geometry Wars was the coolest little game ever. I miss Bizarre Creations. I was astounded by Call of Duty 2, but it was just a much nicer looking World War II FPS. Amazing, to be sure, one of the finest ever, but the concept had been wearing thin. Then, as if he was saving the best for last, he said, "You have to try Condemned." Did the game live up to the hype? Did the Xbox 360 live up to the hype? Of course it did, silly. Right off the rip, the influence of the film Seven is worn right on the game's sleeve, and that's great. It's not a blatant ripoff, but it definitely feels inspired. You play as Ethan Thomas, a special agent for the FBI working under the Serial Crime Unit, or SCU. The fictional city of Metro, which was largely inspired by rundown parts of Seattle, has been seeing a violent crime wave in recent times, as well as an inexplicable surge of bird deaths around the city. When we start the game, Ethan is arriving at a crime scene deep in the belly of a dilapidated building. We're led through the building by Detective Dickerson as he comically whinges about criminals always choosing shitholes for their deeds. Upon arriving at the crime scene, we meet Officer Becker and the three characters walk in. It's here where we get a look at a male mannequin propped up at a table with various dining accoutrements. On the floor lies a deceased woman wrapped in chains, well into rigor mortis. Lined along the walls are faceless mannequins the size of children and sketches of eyes. I struggle to think of a game that, pardon the pun, sets the table so well in terms of atmosphere and tone. The opening trek through the building is a thinly veiled tutorial to get you acquainted with basic movement, but it feels spooky and completely organic, building up the suspense of what the player could be walking into. When you arrive at this scene and start the investigative work, you're completely immersed in what's happening. You want to find out why this happened and what comes next. During the investigation, Detective Dickerson chastises Officer Becker for smoking at a crime scene, to which the officer replies that he's not a smoker. Realizing that somebody nearby lit the butt, the three men break off to find out who else is here. After moving through more of the building, Ethan gets a zap after flipping this lever and drops his handgun. A mystery man walks into frame, picking up the pistol and points the weapon at Ethan. After further travel through the property, Ethan is ambushed by the culprit with your pistol, except now he's not simply taunting you. After implying that he and Ethan share a common goal, the assailant terminates Dickerson and Becker with your weapon, and Ethan is tossed through a window to the streets below. This dramatic sequence sets in motion the events of the game. Ethan wakes up in his apartment greeted by a man named Malcolm Van Horn, who informs us that the FBI is in pursuit of Agent Thomas for the alleged murder of the two officers, as his gun had been used in the slayings. Now, right away, you might ask why Ethan wasn't recovered by law enforcement and EMS and taken to a hospital where he could have carried out a proper after-action report or an interview with investigators where he could profess his innocence. But then, you might also ask why a humanoid demon with metal in its mouth would challenge you to a collie duel in a barn. With Condemned, you just kinda gotta go with it, alright? There are simply elements of the plot that, especially late in the game, come off as bizarre or confusing, but the basic mystery along the way is highly fascinating. Ethan's contact and lab assistant from the Bureau, Rosa, is still in contact with us, and she believes that Agent Thomas is an innocent man. So, in secret, she agrees to help Ethan figure out what in the world is going on and to eventually prove that his hands are clean of the crimes that he's been accused of. Malcolm Van Horn doesn't play a big role in the plot until much later in the tale, but Rosa is our ride or die, and I love the dynamic between her and Ethan throughout the tale. Every time she chimed in, I felt like a piece of the plot was slowly coming together, that progress towards the truth was being made. And she's written as highly intelligent, pragmatic, staunch, and fair. She's not pretentious, snide, or overly friendly. She just wants to do the right thing. And I really love that, despite his flaws as a human and the obvious duress that he's under, Ethan really reciprocates the professional respect and healthy admiration for Rosa as an ally. Not to mention, I just kinda nerd out on all the crime drama throughout the tale. I don't like serial killer documentaries or too much real crime stuff. It's just too depressing after a while, frankly. But in fiction, I love it. Season 1 of True Crime might be the greatest series, ever. Seven is one of my favorite films of all time. And of course, Silence of the Lambs, another film the team at Monolith took inspiration from for Condemned, has one of the greatest fictional crime drama webs ever woven on film. Condemned doesn't quite hit those high notes, but it does have a killer premise. Anyway, as it turns out, the mystery man that shot the two officers in the abandoned building has taken a keen interest in Agent Thomas and, more specifically, the cold cases of serial killers that Ethan was once in pursuit of. More to the point, Rosa dubs this guy Serial Killer X, or SKX. As it turns out, SKX has been killing the killers, notably the ones that Ethan had previously been pursuing as an agent. What's more, SKX eliminates these killers in the very fashion that they were notorious for. For instance, the very first crime scene is that of a man dubbed the Matchmaker, who liked to pose his victims, females, in these sort of living pictures with male mannequins. Upon finding the Matchmaker's corpse in the department store further in the game, SKX has his body propped up against a female mannequin to play with, and slightly against, the typical Matchmaker MO. Chasing SKX along this story and finding the grisly scenes that he's left behind is incredibly engaging. On one hand, he's kind of doing a good deed, one could argue, but he's also clearly a madman. And what makes for a great hook is why SKX takes a keen interest in Ethan Thomas, sparing him from death when it's shown quite clearly that SKX is capable of violence. Further into the game, in meeting up with Rosa, she describes some of Ethan's medical history, some of which has been redacted, such as an x-ray of his throat. She describes that his strength and bone mineral density are much greater than that of an average man. Why is this so mysterious? What does the censored x-ray mean? And what's Malcolm Van Horn's involvement in all of this? Well, the thing about Condemned is, if the story had simply remained on this course, grounded and gritty, Thomas trying to prove his innocence and tracking SKX one grisly scene after another, it would have been perfect. Nice and simple, tension and thrills, intrigue and horror, a twist or two. But that's not exactly the way things go. I strongly urge you to play this game if you haven't already, so if you don't want the finer details of Condemned Criminal Origins' plot spoiled, skip ahead to this timecode. Throughout the game, Monolith incorporates questionably supernatural, creepy moments. The on-screen filter will alter, a spooky shadow creature will scurry into a fissure, or a flock of birds will come smashing through a large window. You even briefly battle an odd-looking humanoid demon thing in the attic of a farmhouse. These moments are brief, creepy, and get you to ask questions, but they don't usually cross over into complete schlock yet. So, after a bit of detective work in the farmhouse, Ethan finds the body of a serial killer known as the Torturer. What he would do is set his victims loose and hunt them, subjecting them to complete physical, mental, and emotional humiliation until they decided to take their own lives, as the Torturer didn't like to take the final blow. In this farmhouse, SKX had subjected him to the same fate, up until he ended everything by impaling himself with a fire poker. So far, awesome premise, and I'll talk about my love for this level in a little bit. Ethan decides to don the Torturer's clothing and ambush SKX. After springing his trap, Ethan pursues SKX on foot, stopping periodically to brawl with him before, out of nowhere, Ethan is attacked from behind by Malcolm Van Horn. We then hear Van Horn refer to SKX as his nephew, as well as calling him Leland. Yup, Leland Van Horn. Malcolm pleads with him, as he believes Leland isn't in his right mind. Yeah, no shit, Malcolm. Leland knocks Malcolm out and Ethan faints.
Welcome to consciousness, my friend. Though you won't enjoy it long.
Upon waking up, Leland has tied up Ethan in a barn. This scene is one of the many that I remember specifically from my first playthrough nearly 2 decades ago. I love how much scene chewing there is here. Leland, Serial Killer X, is most certainly going to finish Agent Thomas off, but before doing so, he needs to do the big bad guy thing of explaining his grand plan. SKX informs Ethan that he simply used the agent to track his victims, the other killers. Then he takes a blade to Ethan's finger in a pretty gruesome and effective scene. Right up until this moment, everything is fairly grounded and intriguing, and then it kind of goes off the rails a tad. Malcolm breaks Thomas free and tells him to go find and destroy the one who has caused all this madness. The one what? Wait, this thing? The goofy looking dude with the metal mouth, the skullet, and the aluminum collie sticks? Why is this thing responsible for what's been wrong with this city?
You belong to us, Ethan. You have always belonged to us.
Did it say that? Why does Agent Thomas belong to them? So, I recognize this thing from the train. I know it's kind of been stalking you throughout the game a bit, but it's the source of the city's madness? Oh, okay. This thing is known as the Oro Dark Primary, which is never stated during the game. You find out much more about the Oro in the sequel. So, Ethan battles a swath of influenced, that's what the violent hobos are called by the way, as this thing watches on like Shao Kahn. After his army of bums fail him, the beast jumps down to do the job himself. You battle him a bit, pulling metal out of his body, as one does. Hey, ow! Eventually, Ethan enters the third phase of the battle and... What is this? Is this like the Shadow Realm or something? I don't know. But what I do know is that this monochrome aberration ends with Ethan tearing off this thing's jaw and sending it crashing below. An explosion kicks off, and Ethan goes searching for Van Horn. Malcolm and Ethan take a car ride away from the scene, where it's explained that Ethan can never go back to his old life. But why? Van Horn explains that hate is everywhere, that mastering fear and controlling hatred is perhaps the most difficult thing a person can do. Okay. I'll buy the allegory of the metal monster as the true representation of hatred, and that it's tough to overcome one's demons, and that everyone in town is going crazy because they're infected with this hatred and fear towards one another. Hey, it's like 2020. Defeating the monster signifies a man overcoming this fear and hatred. That's actually a great message. End it there. But Ethan hears a noise in the trunk and demands that Malcolm pull over. In the trunk is Leland, SKX. Malcolm explains that Leland was a good boy, he robbed people to pay for college, etc., etc. But after Ethan calls Malcolm old, he prepares to execute Leland. And then, wait, there are more of these metal monster things? Do they represent the fear and hatred calling back to Ethan, tempting him to pull the trigger? Guys, I'm really trying to make lemonade here. In a cool scene, you get 5 seconds to either shoot Leland or demonstrate compassion. I chose compassion, and Leland whips out a .45 anyway and pops himself under the chin. Well, good job protecting him, Malcolm, you old bitch.
Listen, old man.
So, a bit of an odd chain of events in the latter half of the story, but again, I could bite if there was a metaphoric manifestation of hatred in that metal monster. I could stretch for that. But then Ethan and Rosa meet up at a diner. Turns out, Ethan was cleared of his charges after all. Great. But then Rosa says,
Yes, very odd. A cult seems to be behind all this.
Wait, what?
Anyway, the results suggest an ancient group of extremists, possibly over 200 years old, may be behind all this.
What? Oh god. What is this? Alright, so now there's a cult behind everything, evidently. Rosa looks out for our boy and lets him know the conversation is being recorded. He denies knowledge, Rosa exits stage left, and Ethan goes to look at himself in the mirror, I guess. And then...
Gary,
What?
come on.
Alright, so we end on whatever that was. That's the story of the first game, and the ending just kinda states, yeah, there's a cult behind everything, and then we're teased with Ethan becoming fully corrupted by the hate. Spoilers over. Early in development, Condemned was originally known as The Dark, and as you can see by the footage here, Agent Thomas, then known as Agent Cross, just straight up has supernatural powers. This actually kind of reminds me quite a bit of Second Sight. But anyway, the initial draft of Condemned, so to speak, was going to lean a lot more into the supernatural stuff, with the paranormal, occult type jazz playing a greater role in the plot overall, I assume. Agent Cross, OG Thomas, was supposed to have been on a mission sanctioned by the FBI, which means he was probably going to be a lot more Fox Mulder than a Richard Kimball. The final version, the game we get to play, stripped a lot of that back in favor of the more gritty, realistic serial killer thriller archetype. In the sequel, Monolith does explain what's going on, for good or ill, but at the time of the first game's release, the ending was really quite confusing. But hey, enough negativity. I personally love playing through the story of Condemned. Are there contrivances and oddities? Yes. Is it super deep? No, and it doesn't need to be. The twist of John Doe's delivery in 7 is legendary, but the plot leading up to it is pretty straightforward, as it should be. But regardless, when you're chatting with Rosa about the forensic analysis of a pair of severed lips under a chalkboard, hot on the tail of SKX, I always get a bit of that uncomfortable eagerness that the best fictional crime thrillers offer. I want more, but I'm afraid of what I'll find. But you're compelled to carry on. And that's all I need. Simple is good. Something the sequel missed completely, by the way, but we'll get there. And hey, speaking of forensic analysis,
when people criticize the creativity of other people, it just really curls my hair.
So that's what happened there. Never mind.
So, the basic heart of the gameplay in Condemned can be distilled into combat and forensic investigations. Early on, the team at Monolith hyped Condemned with the promise of immersive melee combat, and in my opinion, they absolutely delivered. Melee combat is unlike anything in first-person gaming. The only thing that resembles it is Escape from Butcher Bay, one of my favorite games ever. Maybe Dark Messiah, but combat in Condemned is something else, man. Melee is simple. You swing various blunt instruments at the bad guys. Depending on how you drag your mouse or stick during a strike, Ethan will swing in that direction. You can block, kick, and use a taser. The big hook of Condemned's weaponry is the fact that everything feels organic to the environment that you're in. You can pull lead pipes right from a plumbing system, rip an electrical conduit straight out of the wall, pull the door off of a locker, or even yank a wooden desktop right off the metal. This is just so awesome. It makes the world feel alive and dynamic, as opposed to simple static texture sheets over a wire model. And back in 2005, this was mind-blowing to me. The weapon models are all large and very detailed, and the way Ethan swings each weapon has a genuine sense of weight, or lack thereof, to emphasize the type of object that you're holding. And this isn't just a neat graphical trick. Each weapon has its own values, or attributes. Damage dealt, speed, block potential, and reach, and they genuinely do make a difference. For instance, a wooden desktop is going to do less damage than a sledgehammer, but is wider and smaller, and thus has greater blocking and is faster to swing. I've played through the game about 5 times over the years, and I always favored the biggest, heaviest objects with the best damage, but during this playthrough, I mixed it up and ended up getting way more into the speed and block potential of the smaller weapons. The cool thing is, there isn't necessarily an advantage to one over the other, and really, how you select your weapon is based on if you want to serve concrete on rebar or cleave a skull with a rusty paper cutter. Decisions. The only time you'll really need to grab a different weapon is when the game needs it. Throughout, You'll have certain doors that can only be accessed by chopping through with a fire axe, breaking a lock with a sledgehammer, or disabling an electronic keypad with a shovel. These specific weapons act like keys in a traditional FPS, and it's okay. The problem with this mechanic is that sometimes, in anticipation of a locked area up ahead, you may feel compelled to hang on to a heavy key weapon instead of trying other stuff out. Getting rid of this mechanic is one of the few things I'd say that the sequel objectively improved upon. Then you have instances where some obstacles and path reroutes are incredibly contrived, like Ethan needing to acquire a fire axe to break through this stairwell railing in order to dislodge a piano. I mean, he really couldn't just climb over this stuff? Oh well, I will say that these instances are minimal, thank goodness, and it's not inherently bad to have to run back and grab a key weapon if you need to, as nearly every environment is a joy to trek through. But what really makes this running around kind of a pain is that Ethan Thomas may have the worst mobility of any video game character ever. Ethan can sprint for maybe 3 seconds, and it feels more like a brisk jaunt about his environment. I'm glad there was a sprint, as this wasn't commonplace in first-person games just yet, but he runs out of stamina so quickly, and it takes ages for the meter to replenish. Also, if you traverse over any, and I mean any sloped surface, Ethan's movement slows to a crawl. Now, this makes sense when negotiating stairs, and frankly, I think it's really cool that the team tried to animate Ethan's legs to ascend and descend each stair. If you look closely, it's not 100% accurate, but these little touches really help to emphasize that you're playing as a person, not just a camera with a weapon model. The problem is, if you're running and you stumble over a small sloping surface of rubble or garbage, the same slowdown to Ethan's gait cycle occurs, and it's really annoying sometimes. Not a deal breaker, certainly, and really, this game is not supposed to move at a breakneck pace, even when you are breaking necks. Ah. Hell yeah, dude. If you knock an enemy down to their knees, you have 4 options for execution moves. The neck snap, as you saw, a big haymaker across the chops, which launches a dude, a head smash into the ground, or Ethan can just straight up headbutt somebody into the afterlife. Aside from the neck breaker, it is odd how these moves are fatal, but you could use the storyline as an excuse, what with Ethan having an extra dense musculoskeletal system and all. But either way, it's pretty cool to have these quick fatalities in the pocket. Or you can just boot someone like Duke Nukem, which is awesome. Kicking is great, and if you look up high, Ethan will throw a side kick. It's kinda goofy from a pudgy detective that couldn't win a foot race against a dead tsetse fly, but still appreciated. It adds variety to the combat too, and when you're smashing one baddie with a bit of rebar, throwing a sidekick, hitting a thug with a taser charge, and then headbutting the downed baddie, combat can become fairly diverse. Now, it's not too in-depth, and usually the game will only throw 1 to 3 enemies at the player, so you won't be stringing together combos or anything like that. And I really like that. It makes each encounter feel like a big deal. Regardless of the silly story bollocks, you don't feel like a super agent. You feel more like you're taking on another man, an equal match. Well, usually. I had already discussed the final boss in the spoiler section of this review, but to recap without spoilers, it was weird to suddenly be taking on a Kali stick fighter with style and grace, and it's kinda lame. And I discussed the chase scene in a certain house with a certain serial unaliver. Other than that, there's really only one other sort of boss fight, and that's against the lunch lady in the school. I will never forget seeing this for the first time. It's equal parts disturbing, hilarious, and completely over the top. Set inside of a gnarly meat locker, this monstrosity has a big old meat cleaver that she flails wildly. Now, I brought my grease gun when I was recording this footage, which makes the fight trivial, but it's not that hard with melee either. It just seems like someone at Monolith loved Chris Farley as the lunch lady, and said, guys, we have a level in a school, we have to do this. And I'm so glad that they did. One encounter I wish they had left out, however, is this supernatural brawl against these lame characters that look like white Flava Flav. They come out in numbers and lunge at you, forcing you to do this stupid break-free mechanic by wiggling your mouse left to right. It's corny, because there aren't any invincibility frames, leading to one pounce after another. Ugh. You do get other, less frustrating enemy varieties as well, such as these little skinny, emaciated creeps that slink around and scurry about. Also, doesn't that look like, And much like with Fear having the giant, white, armored replicants, Condemned has its own brand of big bads. Seeing these giants lurch across the screen, taking these huge wind-up swings that have a shitload of force and power behind them, hearing their bellowing manic grunts of exertion and frustration, it's just awesome. And this is ultimately what I love so much about the melee battles in Condemned Criminal Origins.
Fucking hurts!
Every battle feels potent. Enemies are pissed off. They tear weapons from the wall, charge you, shout in anger when you best them, and will at times run off to reformulate their plan of attack. The AI is something akin to goal-oriented action planning, or GOAP, as seen in Monolith's other masterpiece, Fear. I elaborated a bit on this system in my review of Fear, so I won't go down that rabbit hole again, but the AI in Condemned truly brings this major gameplay element to life. It's also a blast to get the baddies to fight with each other like Doom 2. Oh, and I had mentioned the taser. Ethan gets to project a bit of electricity at his foes, which stuns them long enough for a nice bash or a swift boot. It recharges, and then you get to use it again. It can really get you out of a tight jam when you're faced with multiple opponents. Eventually, Ethan gets a super taser that lays opponents out flat. And if you're aggressive enough, you can run up to your stunned opponent and steal their weapon. I love that they have that "ah shit" look on their face when you swipe their pipe. That didn't sound right. Or maybe it did. Condemned also has projectile weapons, but these are not standard gaming pea shooters. Firearms are extremely loud and have a tremendous sense of power to them, as they should. I don't know how many of you have shot a .45 in real life, but it's not for the limp-wristed. The game conveys the very real danger of firearms, and it's not just the audio-visual illusion, which is superb, but in a gameplay sense, firearms are a special item found infrequently throughout the game. Guns being this precious commodity makes finding them really exciting, especially because they only have a handful of rounds in them at all times before they're useless. You can use the butt end to bash enemies when you run dry, or hit tab to switch over to using it as a blunt instrument if desired. It is odd that Ethan can't tuck an empty pistol away for when he may find a spare magazine, and wouldn't an agent have a holster? I mean, it's not an issue here, it's just a quirk. This is another thing that Condemned 2 addresses, by the way. Shotguns, in particular, are big and powerful. Laying some shot shell down at close range is pretty intense in this game. The pump action is a real slugger, but the sawn-off over-under is downright devastating. The revolver is a beast, and is almost as good as my favorite revolver in FPS history, that being the wheel gun in BioShock. The submachine gun is probably my favorite of the bunch, and is absolutely devastating in close quarters. I love the design, looking like a mix between the M3 grease gun with the ejection port cover and vertical magazine, and a Sten with that big fat ported barrel. At a few points, you also gain access to a rifle that absolutely devastates everything in its way. I'm glad this thing was rare because it's a really tasty power trip for a short period of time, and too much would spoil it. The other half of the gameplay coin in Condemned are the forensic investigations. Essentially, when you're in the right spot, Ethan's instincts will kick in, altering the screen ever so slightly and prompting you to ready your tools for analysis. Now, I must say right off the bat that this is about as simple as gameplay can get. The game selects the tool for you. The area of investigation is small, and the chances of failure don't exist. That said, I love this stuff. Finding an area, breaking out the tool, and sending the report back to Rosa for her to analyze and return the results is a satisfying gameplay loop. Look, I haven't the faintest idea of what these instruments are. I'm not a forensic scientist, and I don't have any clue if these things actually exist. But they look like they could be real, and the satisfying clicks, crunches, beeps, and flashes they emit sell the illusion that you're actually doing a bit of detective work. Initially, I was going to research this stuff and compare fiction with reality, as I'm apt to do from time to time. Then I realized that it doesn't really matter. Once again, it's all very simple, but it also serves to break up the pace of the gameplay. The forensic stuff seems to happen at just the right time to keep melee combat from getting stale, and vice versa. There are also a few really great moments involving detective work. The one that sticks out to me in particular is the trail of words that Ethan has to track with his UV light through this creepy farmhouse. You need to find the end of 4 different trails throughout the house, and this is just brilliant. Yeah, there are a couple of little slimy enemies in the house, and the ending sequence is definitely action-packed, but the majority of this level is simply following these trails and photographing a phrase. The optical trick here, where the lettering is only exposed under UV light, is so damn clever, and from a gameplay aspect, really adds a lot of tension since the player is unarmed while tracking. This, combined with the lettering being on the ceiling or under archways, means that you're not looking at what's directly in front of you. Because you know that there are enemies somewhere in the house, every time you hear a floorboard groan under your weight, you can't put that UV light away fast enough to retrieve your weapon. It also doesn't hurt that the visuals, for their day, were incredible. Did you see that guy just spit out some teeth during battle? Yeah, it's like that. Monolith have made some very pretty games in their heyday, and although Condemned is certainly aging, the lighting is still fantastic. The game runs on the Lithtech Jupiter EX engine, the same used in Fear, and if you've played one, you'd recognize the other. Both games have exceptionally good lighting, something that sadly appears to be kind of a dying art nowadays. In a 2005 developer diary, Condemned producer David Hassel, wait, what? No, sorry. David Hassel explains that there are no static lights in Condemned. Every light is dynamic, which means that every shadow is dynamic. Nothing is burned into place. As Detective Dickinson walks through the halls of this grungy building, his flashlight realistically cuts through darkness. The game uses per-pixel lighting, much like the PC port of Silent Hill 2, and like Silent Hill 2, the flashlight beaming in an otherwise darkened area is so rich and moody. I can't think of many games that nail their atmosphere like Condemned. I talked about the forensic stuff earlier, and again, a big reason why I like it isn't so much the simple gameplay, it's the trick of the lighting and use of color that helps to sell the moment. Call me easily occupied, fine. I like pretty colors and shiny things. And there's purple, and there's green. Moody atmospheric lighting is something I just miss in gaming. It's the first thing I think of when the debate comes up on whether or not games are art. Of course they are. precariously crafting these little shaders and layering them to help them accurately reflect what's coming off of them, all to sell the impression of reality to the player? It's weird that just because something is done on a computer and not with a brush, people have to debate this. I know that I can't actually board the vessels in the Fighting Temeraire, but it doesn't stop me from exalting the piece as fine art. This is digital chiaroscuro in its finest form. Sometimes, Monolith love to flex, and they should, like when an enemy pulls a conduit out of a wall and an entire room loses its power. These are the loving touches that your average big budget FPS just can't be arsed to do any longer. Oh well, I guess. You'll also see some phenomenal corpuscular rays or god rays beaming through from time to time, and what can I say? I'm just a sucker for these effects. And in a game so dark, dingy, and dangerous, little envelopes of sunlight peeking through feel like hope is just outside the window. The team also implemented Havoc physics into the world, and I like that they teach you to kick in a room conveniently littered with glass and little objects. The simple pleasures. The weapon models, though certainly starting to show their age, still look solid. The brass parts and threading on pipes, the rusty bolts sticking out of a 2x4, or as hillbillies say, 2x4. You can practically smell these things. In particular, I really appreciate the seemingly nugatory details on some of the weapons, like the little doodles carved into the desktops in the school, with the weathered, rotting wood barely being kept together. And speaking of the little pleasures, I adore the ammo check animation. Not only does this just kind of look neat, it's also an incredibly clever way to reduce HUD elements, which was a big deal early on in the 7th generation of consoles. I touched on it previously, but the animations for enemies do well to contribute to the chaotic scramble of melee combat. Enemies will strike in a variety of ways. They'll feign attacks, slam the ground in a rage if you hit them, point and shout at you prior to running you down, or come sprinting out of cover flailing wildly. The unpredictable mix of animations keeps the combat feeling relatively fresh throughout the entire game. I talked about the big guys and the skinny Tobey Maguire looking enemies earlier, but I held off on one last enemy for this section. The department store influenced. Shit, this is the level in Condemned. The department store was abandoned 14 years ago and is hyped up by Rosa prior to your arrival as housing the worst of the worst criminals in the city. Much like the Butcher, I will never ever forget playing this for the first time with my brother and thinking, I hope those things don't come to life and attack us. But what are the odds? Every time you pass one, you're just waiting for it. But then, the usual influenced are around to attack you. Oh, come here and take a beating, you little sly devil. You've noticed the holiday theme by now, yes? And this is, in part, why the department store is one of my single favorite levels in gaming, ever. The rotting holiday decor, wreaths and Santa masks adorning the walls, and in the center, the skeleton of what was once a lavish Christmas tree, no doubt, still decorated with a few remaining bulbs and the star on top. And if you listen really closely, you can hear the dying sound system revving up to play a warped version of Deck the Halls before cutting out again. If you've watched any of my videos, I've probably rambled about how much I love plain everyday environments in gaming that have been warped by decay. It's a big deal to me. And when I think about it, it probably started with this level right here. I remember JCPenney around the holidays and how exciting that was as a kid, and seeing the equivalent in a game now populated by murderous lunatics against the backdrop of those fading memories, just hats off, Monolith. And just when you think it's the usual bad guys running around, this guy just steps casually off the display. God, this animation is so perfectly creepy. The enemies aren't sprinting at you in a rage or shouting at you. They're calmly stepping around waiting for you. The mannequin enemies aren't in fact sentient mannequins. This type of nonsense didn't come about until the sequel. It's even scarier. These are psychotic people that took up residence in this store and have adopted the clothing and holiday masks available to them. They walk like how you would imagine a mannequin would, and it's disconcerting to say the least. Notice the little effects, like the chunks of mask that break off when you clobber them, and their pinpoint pupils. It may seem negligible, but tiny little pupils means they're probably high off something like opioids or PCP, which makes complete sense as they march towards you with robotic fearlessness. And every level has its flair. In the school meat locker where you fight the butcher, there are several nasty bloody buckets around, which is neat, but these circular drying stains on the plastic shelves where the buckets sit is just such a ghoulish little touch that didn't need to be there, but it adds so much to the nasty atmosphere of the butcher's inner lair. One last thing, I swear. I've brought up the atmosphere in Condemned as a major highlight, and for my money, outside of the department store, the level that exemplifies this most to me is the Apple Orchard farmhouse. Take your time in this level. Look around. The scattered junk and upturned furniture, the shutters clattering against the house, the dirt and bloodstains, the cheesy, outdated hayseed wallpaper, the basement that comes straight out of a childhood nightmare, all combined with the sounds of what is hopefully just the house settling. All the while, Ethan's footsteps pound across the floor, while the boards underneath creak and groan. In some ways, this feels like a precursor to Resident Evil 7 or even PT. And just something about a remote, boring house in the middle of nowhere is frightening on its own. And when you find out what's been going on in that house, it makes a subsequent playthrough even more fascinating. I've probably said this in so many of my videos, but it rings true. If you weren't around for this game when it was new, it would be impossible to understand how exciting this was. The other Xbox 360 launch titles were great. I had mentioned Call of Duty 2 as a standout, with the 60 FPS feeling super smooth and the legendary smoke effects. Project Gotham 3 was fantastic, and again, I really miss Bizarre Creations. And then you have the usual sports titles which all looked fine, Quake 4 which is still crazy underrated in my opinion, and then disappointing clunkers like Perfect Dark Zero. Condemned was this new IP dark horse that came up and stood out above the rest visually. But it's not all sunshine. Sometimes the physics could get really wonky, and I mean really wonky. Now, to be fair, I don't remember this being a problem on the 360 version, and they never ruined the game or anything. I also had 0 crashes, and the frame rate was smooth the entire time. I have read about the bug related to the use of Logitech accessories that causes the frames to stutter into single digits, but I use Razer and didn't have any trouble. That's not a plug, by the way. Unless you want to call me Razer, baby. There is a fix online for this, so don't fret if you're tempted to try the game and you have Logitech. It's all good. Even back then, and it's gotten a lot worse over time, the human faces have always looked kind of rough. The bump mapping is good, with the wrinkles, pockmarks, and stress lines looking okay, but everyone has this weird plastic look, like their heads are wrapped in a sheet of clear vinyl and slathered with Vaseline. It's always been sort of a sore spot for the game graphically, but hey, in the words of Lil Wayne, The graphics have and will continue to look rougher with each generation, but the audio design in Condemned is timeless. I am marking out getting ready to talk about it. The way sounds are transferred from a distance to the player's ears feels so lifelike and immersive. With incredible tricks like 3D sound localization, hearing a vagrant breathing heavily behind a pillar or on the other side of a thin wall before stumbling off to flank you is still gripping in this day and age. The craft of audio design, much like dynamic lighting as discussed earlier, seems to be kind of a dying art, and it sucks. Games like Condemned, Dead Space, and especially Battlefield Bad Company 2 were highlights from around this console generation, and they're still a gold standard for sound design in gaming. I've been ranting about the deafening Firearms sound effects, so I won't belabor the point. But the sound effects during Melee are just as effective, if not more so, due to the intimate nature of the encounters. The sound of a blunt instrument tenderizing flesh, the wallop of cracking bone, the grunts from your enemies that vary based on their size. It's all very dramatic and yet grounded. It gels well with the visuals and gameplay to form this satisfying, memorable package. Then, sometimes sound is minimal by design. These moments of respite help to downshift emotions after a fever-pitch battle. And then, just when you get comfortable, your beehole gets to pucker up again. I had mentioned the ambiance of the department store, and I can't emphasize enough how spectacular it is, but fighting the mannequins here is sick. You can hear how they breathe rapidly under the mask, and how their voice is muffled until you remove the face covering, at which point their voice is clear again. That someone went the extra mile to design sound for under masks and barefaced is a testament to the quality of the monolith from this era. Speaking on voices, the cast does a fine job here. My favorites are Rosa and Ethan. Kimberly Colborn, who also voiced Moya in Infamous, another brilliant game, does a great job at portraying Rosa as confident but not arrogant, intelligent but not smug, and sympathetic without being too emotional. Greg Grunberg, known for several television roles as well as Snap Wexley in these, does an awesome job as Agent Thomas, playing him as a man under great stress, but steadfast and professional. Ethan isn't a jacked and tan superhero, but this is a dude that has seen some seriously gnarly shit in his line of work, and is certainly not a bean counter. I also enjoy Peter Jacobs' performance as SKX.
How does it feel to be on this end of the gun? But listen, you bastard. Don't mess this up for us. We are both on the same path of righteousness.
Peter does well with SKX, as this dude that is clearly disturbed, self-righteous, and also a man that takes pleasure in his path. I love how theatrical his performance is, like he was playing to an audience, but without the overly pretentious gravitas of a stage performance.
Okay. I must admit, I was a bit dramatic.
Turns out, he may have been auditioning for the Oro, but that's for the next game. Also, outside of the theme on the main menu, which is very catchy and memorable, I don't remember a whole lot of the soundtrack from Condemned. Almost exactly like Fear, most music is in service to the overall ambiance of whatever environment the player is in, which is great. Things are scaled back to let the sound effects draw the player's attention. I've heard the argument that the game is somewhat of a glorified tech demo or a playable proof of concept. Although I completely disagree with you, I can absolutely see how someone would think that. The melee is fun to me, but it's pretty basic. The forensic investigations are mostly a glamorized lighting trick with a few pixel clicks to give the illusion that you're accomplishing something. I know, I got that. I think when they scrapped the dark concept and scaled back on the spell casting and all of that, the final product had to be somewhat simplified to release by launch of the new console. So the actual mechanics in the final product are quite rudimentary in nature. But the loop of heavy, crunchy melee, deliberately infrequent yet thunderous firearms, investigation while traversing rundown, corroded environments where the ambiance and atmosphere are second to none, all the while being just a step behind the killer of killers, is incredibly satisfying even 20 years later. Yeah, the story definitely speed wobbles, and the final boss is a bit out of left field, but the majority of Condemned is a horror thriller classic. Simple is good. It's digestible and easy to grasp, and sometimes that's the game you need after a crummy day. Thankfully, it's easy to nab. You could find an Xbox 360 copy for next to nothing if you still have the console. You can download it on the Xbox Marketplace on the Series S or Series X, and I've seen it on sale on Steam a number of times. I wish it would get a remaster, but at least you can still play it pretty easily. Unlike the sequel.
Help me. Other man can get Carl away.
I'm glad there was a sprint, as this wasn't commonplace in